You are standing in the middle of a town square. It is a Tuesday. The year is somewhere around 1310. The sun is out. The market stalls are buzzing. Children are running between the legs of merchants. A dog is stealing bread. And right there, in the center of everything, right next to the vegetable cart, a man is being dragged toward a large iron glove that has been sitting over a fire for the last hour. His crime: he allegedly stole a pig. And the way they are going to figure out if he actually did it is by making him pick up that glove with his bare hands. If God is on his side, his wounds will heal cleanly in 3 days. If they fester, well, that is pretty much a confession. Nobody in that crowd is horrified. Nobody is demanding a lawyer. Nobody is filming it for social media. This is just Tuesday. This is just how things work. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a period of roughly 1,000 years, stretching from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD all the way to the late 15th century, where the things that would make your jaw drop were considered perfectly ordinary, and where the things you take for granted every single day, like, say, washing your hands before surgery, or the concept that maybe drinking your own urine is not a great medical treatment, were either unknown, ignored, or actively mocked. Now, before we dive in, I want to be clear about something. The Middle Ages get a bad reputation. People picture it as this uninterrupted 1,000-year stretch of mud, plague, ignorance, and misery, and that is not entirely fair. Medieval people were not stupid. They were creative, resourceful, deeply spiritual, and operating with the best information they had. They built cathedrals that still stand today. They invented universities. They developed entire legal systems. They had poetry, romance, philosophy, and some surprisingly good cheese. But they also had some absolutely baffling ideas about medicine, justice, hygiene, and the general organization of human life. And that is what we are here to talk about, because the things that were considered completely normal, obvious even, in medieval Europe are the kinds of things that if you described them to a modern person without context, would make them assume you were describing the plot of a fever dream. So let us get into it. These are the weird things that were completely unremarkably Tuesday afternoon normal in the Middle Ages. Chapter 1. Trial by ordeal. Let God sort it out. Let us go back to that town square. The man with the pig, the iron glove, the crowd of perfectly calm onlookers. What you are watching is called trial by ordeal, and for several centuries, it was one of the primary ways medieval Europe decided whether someone was guilty of a crime. Here's the underlying logic, and I want you to really sit with it because it actually makes a kind of internal sense once you understand the worldview behind it. Medieval Europeans, particularly in the early and high medieval period, genuinely believed that God was not some distant passive force who wound up the universe and then wandered off to read a book. They believed God was actively, constantly, minutely involved in the physical world. Every thunderstorm was a message. Every harvest was a verdict. Every event, large or small, was an expression of divine will. So if you needed to know whether someone was guilty, why fumble around with witnesses and evidence, things that could be fabricated, misremembered, or bought, when you could just ask God directly? And that is exactly what the ordeal was. It was a direct appeal to the Almighty. A question posed not to a jury of your peers, but to the Creator of the universe himself. And God, it was firmly believed, would answer. There were several varieties. The hot iron ordeal, which is what our pig thief is facing, involved picking up a piece of heated iron and carrying it a specified distance, usually about 3 paces. Your hand was then bandaged, and 3 days later the bandage was removed. If the wound was healing cleanly, God had declared you innocent. If it was infected, God had declared you guilty, and you would proceed directly to punishment, which was typically something involving the removal of a body part or your neck. Then there was the ordeal of boiling water. You plunged your arm into a cauldron of boiling water and retrieved a stone from the bottom. Again, 3 days, bandage, divine inspection. Same rules applied. The ordeal of cold water worked on opposite logic, which tells you something about the internal consistency of medieval legal theory. You were thrown into a body of water, hands and feet bound. If you sank, you were innocent. Water, being the medium of holy baptism, would accept a pure soul. If you floated, the water was rejecting you, which meant you were guilty. There is an obvious problem here. Innocent people drowned. This was considered an acceptable cost of doing justice. They died innocent, which was spiritually fine. The guilty ones, the floaters, survived long enough to be properly executed, which was the important thing. There was also the ordeal by combat, which had a slightly different flavor. 2 parties would fight each other, either personally or through appointed champions, and whoever won was presumed to have God on their side, and therefore in the right. This one lasted much longer than the others, well into the late medieval period, and shows up repeatedly in legal records, chronicles, and eventually in literature. You know, a certain scene from a certain television series set in a fictional medieval world involving a very large man and a very fast one. That is not pure fantasy. That is based on something real. Now here's the part that genuinely surprised me when I first read about it. The church was actually ambivalent about trial by ordeal from pretty early on. There were theologians and bishops who questioned whether it was appropriate to, as they put it, tempt God by demanding miracles on a schedule. You could not just summon a divine verdict whenever you felt like it. That felt presumptuous. And there was always the nagging problem of what to do when the results were unclear, when the wound was somewhere between infected and healing, or when both combatants were too exhausted to continue. What did that mean? Was God abstaining? Had he decided to be ambiguous on purpose? In 1215, the 4th leader in council formally prohibited clergy from participating in trials by ordeal. And since the ordeal required a priest to bless the proceedings, without that blessing it was just random suffering with no metaphysical weight. This effectively killed the practice in most of Catholic Europe. Within a generation, the ordeal was largely gone, replaced by something we recognize more readily: witness testimony, confession, and something approaching a coherent standard of evidence. But here's the thing I want you to hold on to as we move through this video. For the people who lived under that system, the ordeal was not barbaric. It was not a sign of their stupidity or cruelty. It was a rational response to the world as they understood it. They lived in a universe where the divine was always present and always responsive. The ordeal was not a failure of logic. It was an application of logic to a set of assumptions we no longer share. That does not mean it was good. The cold water ordeal drowned innocent people. The hot iron ordeal burned them. Justice was, by any modern standard, catastrophically unreliable. But weird to them? Absolutely not. This was just how you found out the truth. Oh, and as for our pig thief, records are not specific enough to tell us how he did. But statistically, given that the church ran the proceedings and priests were often quietly sympathetic, and given that burns tend to get a little infected no matter what, his odds were not great. I hope the pig was worth it. Chapter 2. The urine wheel. Medieval medicine. Was something else you are sick. It is the year 1250. You live in a mid-sized town in England, and for the past 3 days, you have had a fever, your stomach hurts, and you feel like something the cat dragged in. So you do what any sensible person of your era would do. You collect your urine in a small flask, you carry it across town, and you hand it to the physician. The physician does not ask about your symptoms. He does not take your pulse first, or ask when the pain started, or inquire about what you have been eating. No, he holds the flask up to the light. He looks at the color. He looks at the consistency. He may, and I want you to be prepared for this, smell it. He might even, depending on the text you are consulting and how committed to his craft he is, taste it. And then he consults his urine wheel. The uroscopy wheel, to give it its proper name, was one of the most widespread diagnostic tools in medieval medicine. It was a circular chart, often beautifully illustrated, sometimes the work of considerable artistic effort, divided into segments corresponding to different colors and conditions of urine, 20 different colors or more in some versions: white, pale, subpale, citrine, subcitrine, golden, subruby, red, green, livid, black, and numerous shades in between, each one corresponding to a different diagnosis and suggesting a different treatment. White and watery urine meant cold phlegmatic conditions, probably something wrong with the kidneys or the digestion. Red or bloody urine pointed to heat and inflammation. Black urine was bad news. Black urine was basically the medieval equivalent of a doctor walking into the room, sitting down slowly and folding their hands in their lap. This all sounds ridiculous until you understand the theoretical framework it was built on, which is actually pretty elegant in its way. Medieval medicine in Europe was almost entirely derived from ancient Greek and Roman sources, primarily Hippocrates and Galen, filtered through Arabic scholarship, particularly the work of the Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose enormous encyclopedia of medicine, the Canon of Medicine, was a standard university text for centuries. The underlying theory was humoral medicine, the idea that the human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health was a matter of keeping these in balance. Disease was an imbalance. The physician's job was to identify which humor was in excess and correct it. And urine in this system was a window into the whole body. It was produced in the kidneys, or so they thought, though the details were a bit murky. And it carried information about everything going on inside. The color reflected the state of the humors. The smell reflected the state of the digestion. The consistency reflected the balance of hot and cold, wet and dry, the 4 fundamental qualities that governed all matter. This was not superstition. This was science. It was wrong science. The 4 humors do not exist, and urine color tells you much less than medieval physicians thought it did. But it was systematic. It was teachable. It was based on observation and logic, and it was taken with a tremendous intellectual seriousness by some of the most educated people in Europe. Uroscopy manuals were among the most copied medical texts of the period. Physicians carried their knowledge of the urine wheel the way a modern doctor carries a stethoscope. It was a symbol of professional identity as much as a practical tool, and patients expected it. If you came to a physician and he did not want to examine your urine, you would have serious doubts about his credentials. The treatment that followed from the diagnosis was also perfectly logical within the humoral framework. Too much heat? You needed cooling foods, lettuce, cucumber, things associated with moisture and cold. Too much phlegm. You needed something to dry you out and warm you up. The humors could be corrected through diet, through purging, through bloodletting, which we will get to in a moment, or through a range of herbal preparations. Some of these treatments were genuinely effective because medieval herbalists had centuries of empirical knowledge about which plants did what, and some plants really do have pharmacological effects. Others were completely useless, and some were actively harmful, bloodletting, for instance. The idea that removing blood from the body would correct an excess of the sanguine humor, the blood humor associated with heat and moisture and an excess of enthusiasm, led to a practice that weakened already ill patients, sometimes fatally. George Washington is believed to have been killed not by his original illness, but by the aggressive bloodletting performed by his doctors, and his doctors were trained on methods that had not changed all that much from medieval practice. The urine wheel and its associated therapies had a very long tail, but here, again, is the key point. To a medieval person, consulting a physician about their urine was not weird. It was responsible. It was exactly what you did. The idea that you would describe your symptoms in words, or that a doctor would look inside your body with some kind of device, or that disease was caused by tiny invisible organisms, that would have sounded like the most extravagant fantasy. But pee in a flask? That was just Tuesday medicine. One more detail worth mentioning: the flask itself. The matula, a round-bottomed glass vessel specifically designed for urine examination, became such a symbol of the medical profession that in many medieval and early modern illustrations, you can identify a physician simply by the fact that he is holding one. It was the stethoscope of its day, the badge of the healer, a little glass globe full of someone else's urine, held up to catch the light. Medicine has made a lot of progress. I feel confident saying that. Chapter 3: The Medieval Bathhouse. Community, commerce, and chaos. There is a persistent myth that medieval people never bathed, that they were uniformly filthy, odorous, and indifferent to personal hygiene, that they went weeks or months, or possibly their entire lives without washing. This myth is, to put it plainly, wrong. But the reality it obscures is, in its own way, even more interesting. Medieval people bathed. Towns of any significant size had public bathhouses. They were common enough that city governments regulated them, that guilds of bathhouse keepers existed, and that a visit to the bathhouse was a normal, socially unremarkable activity. Chroniclers mention them the way modern writers mention gyms, as background furniture of urban life, nothing worth commenting on except when something unusual happened. The bathhouses, called stews in England, from an older word for a heated room, were large establishments, often with multiple bathing chambers, and they operated on a simple economic model. You paid, you bathed, you left. In larger towns, they might run all day. In smaller ones, they might have specific days for men and days for women, or they might operate with everyone together, which is the part that tends to make modern people do a double take. Mixed bathing was not universally practiced. There was significant variation by region, period, and establishment. But it was common enough that contemporary sources discuss it, debate it, and occasionally rail against it with the energy of someone who has seen things they cannot unsee. Large communal tubs, big enough for a dozen people. Men and women bathing together. Attendants providing services that ranged from washing and hair care to back scrubbing to, in many establishments, sexual services, because a significant number of medieval bathhouses were also brothels, or at minimum had rooms available for purposes that had nothing to do with hygiene. This is the part that has caused some historians to overcorrect in the other direction, assuming that all bathhouses were essentially brothels, and that medieval bathing culture was primarily about sex. This is also too simple. There were plenty of respectable bathhouses, institutions patronized by merchants, clergy, and ordinary townspeople who simply wanted a bath and maybe a shave. The fact that the word stew eventually became slang for brothel in English tells you something about the reputation certain establishments developed, but it does not tell you that bathing and prostitution were synonymous. They coexisted, sometimes in the same building. This was the Middle Ages. The zoning laws were complicated. What is genuinely striking is the social dimension of bathing. A bathhouse visit was often a social occasion. You went with friends. You ate and drank there. Many establishments sold food and wine. You had conversations. You conducted business. The bathhouse was a social institution in a way that has no real modern equivalent, something between a spa, a pub, and a community center, all located around a large communal tub of hot water. The church had complicated feelings about this. On one hand, cleanliness was associated with spiritual purity, and ritual washing was woven through Christian practice. On the other hand, naked bodies in close proximity, mixed company, commercial sex. These were not things the church was naturally enthusiastic about. The result was a lot of strongly worded pastoral letters, and not a great deal of actual behavioral change. The bathhouses kept operating. The bishops kept writing letters. There was also a shift in medical thinking across the medieval period that affected bathing attitudes in a complicated way. Early medieval medicine inherited from Rome a generally positive view of bathing, but as the period progressed, and particularly as plague became a recurring catastrophe after the Black Death of the mid-14th century, medical opinion began to shift. The miasma theory of disease, the idea that disease was caused by bad air, corrupt vapors rising from rotting matter, led some physicians to argue that open pores from bathing made the body vulnerable to absorbing these vapors. You bathed, your pores opened up, the pestilential air got in, and you died. Therefore, do not bathe, or at least bathe less. This advice, which sounds insane and is medically completely wrong, but was perfectly logical within the miasma framework, combined with the economic disruption of the Black Death, which killed enormous numbers of bathhouse workers and disrupted the social fabric of towns, led to a documented decline in public bathing culture in Europe from the 14th and 15th centuries onward. The Renaissance and early modern period actually had worse personal hygiene norms than the high medieval period in many respects. The Elizabethans, who are often romanticized, were in many ways considerably riper than their 13th century predecessors. But let us stay in our period. In the High Middle Ages, in a prosperous town, the bathhouse was a normal feature of community life. Going there was not remarkable. Getting into a large tub with strangers was not remarkable. The fact that the woman scrubbing your back might also be available for other services, and that this was openly known and navigated as a matter of personal morality, that was not remarkable either. It was just the texture of urban life. Weird? To us, yes. To them, it was just where you went on a Saturday. There is also the matter of private bathing to address, because the image of the medieval person as someone who never bathed often comes from a misunderstanding about the evidence. When we say medieval people had access to bathhouses, we are talking primarily about towns. Rural peasants, the majority of the population, had less access to bathing infrastructure, but they were not oblivious to washing. They washed hands and faces regularly. They washed in rivers, in streams, in wooden tubs at home. They were not operating at the level of the Roman imperial bath, but the picture of the never-washing medieval peasant is largely a Victorian-era invention, a way for later generations to congratulate themselves on their own superiority. The truth is both more banal and more interesting. Medieval people bathed when they could in ways that made sense for their resources and circumstances, and the social architecture around bathing was entirely different from ours. More communal, less private, more mixed with commerce and sociability, and operated under a completely different set of assumptions about bodies, health, and the proper relationship between the individual and the community, which, now that I think about it, describes most of the things on this list. Chapter 4. Putting animals on trial. The medieval courtroom had no chill. It is 1386. The town of Falaise in Normandy, France. A sow, a female pig, has attacked and killed an infant child. The child's face and arms were badly mauled. The sow is apprehended. She is brought before a court. She is formally charged with murder. She is given a trial. She is convicted. And then, in a detail that I want you to really sit with, she is dressed in human clothes, a jacket, gloves, and breeches, and publicly hanged in the town square, in front of an audience that includes reportedly other pigs who were brought to witness the execution as a deterrent. This is not a legend. This is a documented legal proceeding. The court records exist. The expense accounts for the execution exist. The town paid for the clothes, for the executioner's fee, for the whole production. This was a real trial, conducted by real judges, under real law, with real consequences for a real pig. And it was not a one-off. Animal trials were a genuine, recurring feature of medieval and early modern European legal life. Historians have documented hundreds of them, spanning from the 9th century to the 18th, across France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and beyond. Pigs, horses, bulls, goats, dogs, wolves, caterpillars, locusts, weevils, eels, rats, and at least one rooster accused of the theologically alarming crime of laying an egg. All of these and more were formally prosecuted in courts of law. There were two distinct types of animal trial, and understanding the difference between them tells you a great deal about how medieval people thought about the relationship between the human world and the natural one. The first type was the criminal trial of individual animals, usually large domestic animals like pigs, horses, or bulls, accused of specific violent crimes against human beings. These followed the standard format of a criminal proceeding. There was an accusation, an arrest, a period of detention, a trial, a verdict, and a sentence. The animal was treated legally and procedurally as a person. It could be tortured for confession, though obviously confession was not forthcoming, which created some procedural awkwardness. It could be convicted, sentenced, and executed. Its punishment was meant to fit the crime. A pig that had killed and partially eaten a child might be maimed in the same places the child had been injured before being killed, as a form of proportional justice. Why? Because medieval legal theory held that certain offenses against the natural order, murder above all, required formal, public, legal acknowledgement and punishment regardless of who or what committed them. The death of a child was not something that could simply be absorbed into the background noise of existence. It required a response. It required justice. And justice in this framework meant a trial, a verdict, and an execution. The fact that the perpetrator was a pig was procedurally inconvenient, but not philosophically disqualifying. There was also a deeper theological dimension. Medieval Christian thought held that the world, after the fall of Adam and Eve, was disordered, that the harmony between humans and animals that had existed in Eden was broken. Wild nature was threatening, unpredictable, dangerous. An animal that attacked a human was not just acting on instinct. It was, in a sense, acting out the disorder of a fallen world. Prosecuting it was a way of asserting human, and by extension, divine, order over that chaos. The second type of animal trial was ecclesiastical. conducted by the church rather than secular courts, and involved not individual animals, but entire species or infestations. The most famous examples involve agricultural pests, rats, mice, weevils, caterpillars, and locusts that were destroying crops. These were tried in church courts, and the proceedings could be genuinely elaborate. The animals were summoned to appear in court by formal written summons, which were read aloud in the fields where the pests were found, since the animals could not exactly receive mail. If they failed to appear, and they consistently failed to appear, they were tried in absentia. A defense counsel was appointed to argue on their behalf, and these defense arguments were often remarkably sophisticated. One French lawyer, defending a group of rats accused of destroying a barley crop in the 16th century, argued that his clients could not be expected to appear in court because the journey was too dangerous, the roads were infested with cats, and it would be unreasonable to demand that the defendants risk their lives to attend their own trial. The judge apparently found this argument compelling and granted a continuance. The outcome of these ecclesiastical trials was usually not execution, but excommunication or a formal curse. The church formally withdrawing its protection from the offending creatures and commanding them in the name of God to depart. Sometimes this was accompanied by practical measures, blessed fields, specific prayers, designated sanctuary areas where the animals were permitted to live if they left the crops alone. This last detail is genuinely charming. The court would sometimes carve out a designated zone of tolerance, a sort of animal nature reserve established by judicial decree as part of the settlement. Did any of this work? For the pest infestations, probably sometimes, in the sense that infestations do eventually end on their own. And if they ended after the ecclesiastical proceedings, the proceedings got the credit. For the individual criminal trials, the question of deterrence, those other pigs watching the fillet's execution, is harder to evaluate. Pigs, as it turns out, do not respond especially well to public hangings as a corrective mechanism. Pig crime continued throughout the medieval period. What is striking about all of this is not the absurdity, though it is genuinely wonderfully absurd, but the underlying seriousness. These were not jokes. The lawyers were real lawyers, arguing real legal points. The judges were taking real judicial care. The church officials were conducting real theological proceedings. Everyone involved believed, completely sincerely, that this was the correct and appropriate response to the situation. The framework that made it make sense was wrong, but the commitment to it was real. And honestly, the next time a raccoon gets into your garbage at 2 a.m., just know that a medieval lawyer would have had some thoughts about your legal options. Chapter 5. Public execution as entertainment. Bring the whole family. You are planning your weekend. It is a Saturday in, let us say, 1320, in a prosperous English market town. There is going to be an execution in the town square tomorrow. A man convicted of theft and murder. You are thinking about going. Not despite the fact that it will be violent and public and end with someone's death because of it. You pack a lunch. You bring your children. You get there early to get a good spot. Public execution in the Middle Ages was not a shameful, hidden, quietly administered act. It was a civic event. It was theater. It was, by the standards of the time, a form of public entertainment, and the crowds that gathered for notable executions could be enormous. Thousands of people in major cities, pressing in around scaffolds, climbing onto rooftops and walls for a better view, buying food and drink from vendors who had set up specifically for the occasion. This is genuinely difficult for modern sensibilities to absorb. We tend to think of the desire to watch an execution as something pathological, a sign of moral deficiency or desensitization. But in the medieval world, attending an execution was not considered a character flaw. It was considered appropriate. It was, in many ways, considered a civic duty. Here is why. Medieval execution was not primarily about punishment in the modern sense, about removing a dangerous person from society, or about rehabilitation, or about deterrence in the abstract. It was about something much more public and much more theatrical, the restoration of order. When someone committed a serious crime, they had torn the social fabric. The execution was the visible, dramatic, communally witnessed act of repairing it. It was a public performance of justice, and it needed an audience to function. An execution that nobody watched was barely an execution at all. This is why the condemned were almost always walked or paraded through town on the way to the scaffold. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the ritual of public shaming, the community seeing and acknowledging the transgression and then seeing it answered. The procession gave people time to line the streets, to shout, to throw things, to participate in the communal condemnation. By the time the execution itself happened, the crowd had already been part of the process. The methods of execution were, by modern standards, genuinely horrifying, and they were calibrated very deliberately to the nature of the crime. Hanging was the standard for common criminals, not the quick, clinical hanging of later centuries designed to break the neck, but a slow strangulation that could take many minutes. Beheading was considered a mercy. It was fast, it was relatively clean, and it was reserved for nobles and high-status criminals as a form of death appropriate to their dignity. Being burned at the stake was for heretics. The symbolism was theological. Purification by fire. The destruction of the corrupt body that had hosted sinful beliefs. Being broken on the wheel, a method particularly popular in France and Germany, involving strapping the condemned to a large wagon wheel and methodically breaking their bones with an iron rod before leaving them exposed until death, was for the most serious criminals, and it could last hours. There was also drawing and quartering, reserved in England for the crime of treason, and specifically for male traitors. I mention the gender specification because the method was considered too indecent for women, who were instead burned. Drawing and quartering involved being hanged until nearly dead, then being cut down, disemboweled while still alive, castrated, and then having the body cut into 4 pieces, which would be displayed in different locations as a warning. The head typically went on a spike above a city gate. The display of remains afterward was an important part of the ritual. The point was not just to kill the person, but to send a message, and that message needed to be visible for as long as possible. Rotting heads on spikes, bodies left hanging in iron cages called gibbets at crossroads and city gates. These were not just grisly accidents of a violent age. They were deliberate communication. They were the medieval equivalent of a public announcement. This is what happens. This is the consequence. Look at it. Remember it. And crowds did look. Contemporary chronicles describe execution crowds in terms that make it clear this was a significant social gathering. People noted particularly dramatic or moving executions the way we might note a significant sporting event. There are accounts of criminals who died bravely, who made speeches, who showed no fear, who died well, becoming objects of admiration, even unofficial veneration. There are also accounts of executions that went wrong, where the rope broke or the executioner was incompetent, and the crowd's reaction to these mishaps ranged from outrage to dark comedy, depending on the sympathies involved. The emotional register of the crowd was also more complicated than pure bloodlust. Eyewitness accounts describe weeping for criminals who were popular, for those who seemed to die unjustly, for those whose suffering was particularly prolonged. There are accounts of crowds that turned angry when an execution seemed excessive, when a particularly beloved criminal was condemned. Public sentiment mattered. Executions that outraged the crowd could spark riots. The theater of punishment was a dialogue between the authorities and the people were not always passive recipients of the message being sent. There was also a spiritual dimension that modern accounts tend to overlook. Condemned criminals, before their execution, received last rites, confession, absolution, communion. The execution itself was framed as a passage, not just an ending. A criminal who died repentant, who made a full confession and died with spiritual preparation, was not simply being killed, they were being reconciled, in the medieval theological framework, with God. The crowd witnessed not just a death but a soul's departure. This gave the event a weight and a gravity that was genuinely religious, not merely morbid. Weird? By our standards, absolutely. We conduct executions, in the few places they still occur, in near total secrecy, witnessed by a handful of officials and a small number of approved observers. The idea of a cheering crowd with a packed lunch is almost incomprehensible, but in the medieval world, that secrecy would have seemed deeply suspicious. Justice that was not witnessed was not justice. The crowd was not a problem. The crowd was the point. Chapter 6. Privacy did not exist. Everyone knew everything about you. You wake up. You are in a bed. The bed is large enough for several people. And several people are in it. Your spouse, obviously. Possibly one or two of your children. Possibly a servant or an apprentice, depending on your household size. Possibly a guest, a traveler who arrived last night and whom you had never met before yesterday. The concept of giving a guest their own room, their own bed, their own private space is, in your world, a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. And even they do not always bother. Privacy, as we understand it, the idea that you have a right to personal space, to solitude, to a domain of your life that is yours alone and that others cannot intrude upon, is a relatively modern invention. It developed slowly, unevenly, over the course of several centuries, and in the Middle Ages it simply did not exist in any form that a modern person would recognize. This is not just about sleeping arrangements, though those are genuinely startling. It runs through every aspect of medieval life. Medieval people ate together. Large, communal tables, shared dishes, food passed from hand to hand. They worked together. Workshops, fields, kitchens, all collective spaces where you were never alone. They worshipped together. The parish church was not just a spiritual space, but a social hub. The place where community life was organized and displayed. They were born together, surrounded by neighbors and family. They died together. The deathbed typically crowded with family, friends, clergy, and interested onlookers. The architectural evidence tells the same story. Medieval houses, even relatively prosperous ones, were not divided into the specialized rooms we take for granted. Bedroom, living room, kitchen, bathroom, each with a specific function, and the implicit assumption that the people in them have a right to be undisturbed. Medieval houses had halls, large, multi-purpose spaces where everything happened. The same room where you ate your meals was the room where your servants slept, where guests were received, where business was conducted, where children played, and dogs lay by the fire. The great hall of a medieval castle, the grand high-ceiling space that movies tend to use for dramatic feasts, was not just for banquets. It was the nerve center of the entire household. The Lord ate there, yes, but his household also slept there, on the floor, on benches, on hay. Privacy, even for the powerful, was achieved not by going into a separate room, but by going behind a curtain or into a slightly elevated section called the dais, or into the more private solar, a smaller room, usually upstairs, that was the closest thing a medieval household had to a private family space. But even the solar was shared. Even the most intimate spaces of a great household were occupied by multiple people. Shared beds were normal at every social level. Kings shared beds with their queens, with their favorites, with visiting dignitaries. Sharing a bed with someone was not automatically intimate in the modern sexual sense. It was practical. Beds were expensive. Heat was expensive. Huddling together for warmth was not sentiment. It was thermodynamics. Inn-travelers routinely shared beds with strangers. There are medieval etiquette guides, actual written advice literature, that tell you how to behave when sharing a bed with someone you do not know well. Do not hog the covers. Do not make excessive noise. Do not put your cold feet on the other person. This is not a joke. People took this seriously. It was necessary social knowledge. Bodily functions, too, were conducted with a casualness that modern people find deeply uncomfortable to read about. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows into the street, ideally with a warning shout, not always accompanied by one. Outdoor privies, holes in the ground or platforms over rivers, were shared by multiple households. Urinating in public, against walls, in alleys, was unremarkable for men. The concept that bodily functions required a private, dedicated space was absent. The concept that they were inherently shameful or hidden was at best aspirational. Community surveillance was also intense in ways that cut both ways. Yes, you had no privacy, but you also had a community that watched you. Your neighbors knew your business, your finances, your family quarrels, your health, your moral behavior. The parish church was deeply invested in the sexual and moral conduct of its parishioners. Adultery, fornication, usury, and various other sins were not just private spiritual matters. They were community concerns, subject to public penance, social censure, and in some cases, legal consequences. The community's eyes were always on you. This was a form of social control, yes, but it was also, for many people, a form of social support. Your community knew your situation. Your community was likely to help when you needed it, because your community literally could not look away from you. The concept of loneliness, in the modern sense, the aching absence of connection, the sense of being isolated in a crowd, was probably rarer than it is today, because the physical conditions of medieval life made isolation almost impossible. Conversely, what we might call the need for solitude, the desire for quiet, for privacy, for time alone with your own thoughts, had almost no legitimate social outlet, except in the specific context of religious life. Monks and hermits were the medieval world's designated practitioners of solitude, and even they were embedded in structures of communal life. The monastery's communal prayer, the hermit's regular visitors seeking counsel. For the ordinary medieval person, the desire to be alone was not a personality trait to be respected. It was slightly suspicious. Why did you want to be alone? What were you doing that you did not want people to see? Solitude was associated with melancholy, a medical condition in the humoral framework caused by an excess of black bile and not considered a pleasant or desirable state. Being a loner was not a lifestyle. It was a symptom. The gradual emergence of privacy as a value. The slow architectural shift toward specialized rooms, toward corridors that allowed you to move through a house without passing through other people's spaces, toward the bedroom as a genuinely private domain, happened across the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, driven by a combination of increasing wealth, changing ideas about the self, and the influence of humanist thinking about the individual. By the 18th century, the ideal of a private life, a self that existed separately from the community's gaze, was well established among the educated classes of Western Europe. We are, in some ways, still living with the consequences of that shift. The modern epidemic of loneliness, the documented, measurable increase in social isolation across wealthy countries, is in some part a shadow cast by privacy's triumph. We got the solitude we wanted. It turns out, in sufficient quantities, it is not entirely what we expected. Medieval people, for all their lack of personal space, probably did not lie awake at night wondering if anyone really knew them. The problem, if anything, was the opposite. Chapter 7. Sleeping in 2 shifts. The night was a different country. It is midnight. The village is quiet. The fire is burned down to embers. And you are awake, not because something woke you, not because you are anxious or ill or have a crying baby, though all of those things exist in your world and are constant hazards. You are awake because it is midnight, and midnight is when you wake up. This is normal. This is expected. You will lie here, or sit here, or get up and do something quiet for an hour or 2, and then you will go back to sleep until morning. This is just how sleeping works. The historian A. Roger E. Kirch, in his 2005 book At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, documented one of the most quietly revolutionary discoveries in the history of sleep. For most of human history, across most of the world, people did not sleep in one continuous block. They slept in 2 separate periods, with a period of wakefulness in between. He called these the first sleep and the second sleep, terms that appear completely without explanation or elaboration in countless medieval and early modern documents, because they were so ordinary that writers assumed everyone knew what they meant, and indeed everyone did. The pattern shows up in medical texts, in court records, in diaries, in literature, in agricultural manuals. People went to sleep shortly after dark because candles and firewood were expensive, and there was little reason to stay up in the dark. Woke somewhere around midnight, spent an hour or 2 in a state of quiet wakefulness, and then slept again until dawn. The 2-phase sleep pattern was not a disorder. It was the default. What did people do during that middle of the night waking period? A remarkable variety of things, as it turns out. Some prayed. The hours of the night were organized by the church into canonical hours, and certain prayers were specifically associated with the nighttime waking. Monks, whose schedules were built around these canonical hours, got up for matins, the night office, and this was considered the holiest of the prayer hours, the quiet of the night being conducive to spiritual focus. Lay people sleeping at home often used their first sleep waking for private prayer, which explains why certain religious practices were specifically designed to be performed in bed, in the dark, in the middle of the night. Others used the time for more practical purposes. Medical texts recommended that sexual intercourse was best performed during this waking period, after the first sleep had rested the body, and before the second sleep would follow. The logic was humoral. The body was in a better state of balance after rest, and the second sleep would consolidate the beneficial effects of the activity. This is not a fringe recommendation. It appears in multiple medical texts across the medieval period. The middle of the night was, medically speaking, the optimal time for sex. People also talked to their bed partners during this time. Given that, as we established in the previous chapter, most people slept with multiple others in the same bed, the nighttime waking was a social period, quiet conversation, the sharing of dreams, the kind of intimate talk that the demands of the day did not permit. Court records from the early modern period contain testimony from people who describe conversations they had with their spouses or partners during the first sleep-waking as particularly significant, as a time when guards were down and honest communication was more likely. Some people got up entirely. They checked on livestock. They used the privy. In towns, they might step outside for a few minutes. Night was heavily regulated in medieval towns, with curfews and watch patrols, but the complete dark of a pre-electric night was also a space of relative freedom for those who knew how to navigate it. Poachers worked the first sleep-waking. Lovers met. People conducted business that did not bear daylight scrutiny. The psychological texture of the first sleep-waking also seems to have been different from ordinary wakefulness. Kirch documents numerous references to a particular quality of consciousness during this period, a kind of relaxed, semi-dreaming alertness that felt different from the sharper wakefulness of the day. Dreams from the first sleep were discussed and interpreted with particular interest. There was a widespread belief that the visions of the night, and especially those that came in this transitional period, were meaningful, potentially prophetic, worth remembering and examining. The shift to single-phase sleep happened gradually, beginning in the late 17th century and accelerating through the 18th and 19th, driven primarily by artificial lighting, as candles became cheaper, as oil lamps improved, as gas lighting reached cities, and as eventually electric light made night nearly as bright as day. The pressure to go to bed at dark disappeared. People began staying up later. They pushed their sleep time back, and in doing so, they compressed the two-phase pattern into a single block, not because it was better for them, but because the conditions that had produced the two-phase pattern, the long, dark, economical nights of a pre-industrial world, had changed. Here is what makes this genuinely strange from a modern perspective. Sleep researchers in the late 20th century began documenting something they called sleep maintenance insomnia, the frustrating experience of waking up in the middle of the night, being unable to sleep for an hour or two, and then falling back asleep before the alarm. This was increasingly common, increasingly medicated, increasingly treated as a disorder requiring intervention. And Kirch's research suggests that what millions of modern people experience as insomnia may simply be their bodies trying to return to the ancestral, natural, historically normal sleep pattern that their pre-industrial ancestors took entirely for granted. The treatment for this disorder, in many cases sleeping pills, may be medicating away a natural biological rhythm that served human beings well for millennia. The medieval person who woke at midnight, said a quiet prayer, talked to their spouse, and drifted off again after an hour was not experiencing insomnia. They were sleeping correctly. We are the ones who changed the pattern and then pathologized the body's attempt to return to it. Weird? Yes. By modern standards, waking up in the middle of the night on purpose sounds like a nightmare. But this might be one of the few items on this list where the medieval practice was arguably more in tune with human biology than what we replaced it with. Something to think about at 3 a.m. when you are lying there wondering why you cannot sleep. Chapter 8. Sacred Relics. The Medieval Cure. All was a dead person's finger. You are ill. The physician has seen you. He examined your urine. We covered this. Prescribed a change in diet, some herbal preparations, possibly some bloodletting. None of it has worked. You have been sick for 3 weeks, and you are getting worse. So your family does what any sensible medieval family would do. They take you on a journey, not to another doctor, not to a hospital, though those exist, to a church, specifically to a small golden box behind the altar, which contains, among other things, what is reputed to be the finger bone of St. Thomas Becket. You will pray over this box. You will touch it if you are allowed, and you will genuinely expect to get better. And sometimes, remarkably mysteriously, you do. The veneration of saints' relics was one of the most widespread, most commercially significant, and most theologically elaborate practices of medieval Christianity. And it was not a fringe practice, not something confined to the illiterate poor or the credulous peasantry. It was practiced by kings and peasants alike. It was endorsed and regulated by the church. It was the subject of serious theological debate. It generated enormous economic activity, pilgrimage routes, souvenir industries, inter-church rivalries, and it shaped the physical landscape of medieval Europe in ways that are still visible today. The theological logic behind relics was coherent within the framework of medieval Christianity. Saints were holy people who had died and gone to heaven, where they were in the presence of God. Their bodies, which had housed holy souls, retained a kind of sacred charge, a residual holiness that clung to the physical matter of their earthly remains. To touch a relic was to come into contact with this holiness. To pray near a relic was to pray in a place where the boundary between the earthly and the divine was thinner than usual. The saint in heaven heard prayers made near their remains more clearly, or was more likely to intercede on behalf of a petitioner who had made the effort of pilgrimage. The relic was a hotline, a direct connection to a specific saint's ear. Different saints specialized in different things, which gave the relic economy an almost medical directory quality. Saint Apollonia, who had her teeth pulled out before being martyred, was the patron of dentistry and toothache sufferers. Saint Lucy, whose eyes were gouged out, presided over eye diseases and disorders of vision. Saint Roch, who had survived plague, was invoked against epidemic disease. Saint Blaise, a bishop and physician, was the patron of throat ailments. A blessing of the throat on his feast day, February 3rd, involving 2 crossed candles held to the throat, is still practiced in some Catholic churches today. You went to the saint who matched your problem. It was remarkably organized. The market for relics was, by any modern standard, absolutely extraordinary. Demand was constant and insatiable. Every church wanted relics. Every town wanted a local saint. Every cathedral wanted a major relic that would draw pilgrims, who would bring money, which would fund construction and clergy. And supply, while obviously finite, there were only so many saints, and each had only so many body parts, was remarkably elastic, because authentication was, to put it delicately, inconsistent. The scale of duplication in the relic market was something that even medieval observers noticed and commented on with varying degrees of alarm. John Calvin, writing in the 16th century at the dawn of the Reformation, compiled an inventory of relics across Europe and found that Christ's crown of thorns was distributed among at least 3 separate institutions, each claiming to have the original. There were enough pieces of the true cross, the cross on which Jesus was crucified, distributed across European churches, that, as the humanist Erasmus remarked, they could have built a warship from them. There were, by various counts, at least 5 or 6 complete foreskins of Christ, a relic known as the Holy Prepuce, each held by a different institution and each generating pilgrimage traffic. Theological debate about which one was authentic was conducted with the utmost scholarly seriousness. The supply chain for relics was also genuinely alarming. Relics were stolen. The theft of a saint's body, far from being considered a crime, was often framed as the saint's own will. The idea being that a saint would not permit their remains to be moved unless they wanted to go. This practice was known as furta sacra, sacred theft, and it was documented, discussed, and in some cases celebrated in contemporary sources. The remains of Saint Mark, patron saint of Venice, were famously smuggled out of Alexandria in the 9th century, hidden under layers of pork and cabbage to deter Muslim customs officials from inspecting the cargo. Venice built a cathedral for them. That cathedral is still there. Relics were also manufactured. Bones from anonymous graves, animal bones, random bits of wood, scraps of cloth. These entered the relic market alongside genuine remains, distinguished from them primarily by the confidence of the seller and the credulity of the buyer. The church was aware of this problem and made periodic attempts to regulate authentication, but the sheer volume of the trade and the genuine spiritual need it served made enforcement essentially impossible. And yet, and this is the part that is genuinely interesting rather than merely amusing, people got better at these shrines. Not always, not reliably, not in ways that would satisfy a modern clinical trial, but often enough and dramatically enough that the cures were documented, verified by church investigators, and used as evidence for canonization. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury accumulated hundreds of documented miracle cures in the decades after his murder in 1170. People arrived paralyzed and left walking. People arrived blind and left seeing. People arrived dying and left alive. What was happening? Several things, probably. The placebo effect, which is real and measurable and can produce genuine physiological changes in the right conditions, and the conditions at a major shrine. The drama of pilgrimage, the intensity of prayer, the community of fellow pilgrims, the emotional release of confession, and spiritual preparation were close to optimal for maximizing it. Many conditions that seem severe resolve, on their own given enough time, and pilgrimage took time. And by the time pilgrims arrived at the shrine, they had been traveling for weeks or months, giving their bodies that time. And some conditions that presented as paralysis or blindness had functional or psychological components that responded to the intense emotional and spiritual experience of the shrine. None of this requires us to dismiss the experience of the medieval pilgrim. Something real was happening at those shrines, even if the mechanism was not the one the pilgrims understood. The faith was real. The healing was, at least sometimes, real. The finger bone in the golden box was, in the framework of a deeply believing community, doing something. What exactly it was doing is a question that bumps against the limits of what either science or theology can fully explain. Weird? Traveling across the country to pray, over a dead person's knuckle for a cure to your kidney stones? By our lights, yes, but by the lights of a medieval person going to a hospital and lying in a sterile room while strangers pumped chemicals into your bloodstream through a tube would have seemed considerably stranger, and arguably your kidney stones would still be there. The saint, at least, had a track record. Chapter 9. The Dance of Death. When an entire culture became obsessed with dying. You're walking through a churchyard in Paris. It is around 1425. The walls of the cemetery arcade, the covered walkway that runs around the edge of the graveyard, are painted floor to ceiling with a mural. In the mural, death appears in the form of a skeleton, or sometimes a rotting corpse in an advanced state of decomposition, and death is dancing, and dancing with death in a long chain that stretches the entire length of the wall is every rank of medieval society. The Pope, the Emperor, the King, the Bishop, the Knight, the Merchant, the Peasant, the Child, the Infant. Each one is being led, sometimes willingly, sometimes dragging their feet, by a grinning, skeletal death who is having, by all appearances, a wonderful time. And the text beneath each figure, in verse sometimes funny, sometimes savage, has death speaking directly to each person about exactly what they thought made them special, and exactly why it does not matter. This is the danse macabre, the dance of death, and it was one of the most significant cultural phenomena of the late medieval period. It appeared on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, in woodblock prints, in theatrical performances, in poetry. It spread from France across Germany, England, Switzerland, Spain, and beyond. It was reproduced, copied, adapted, and reimagined constantly across the 15th century and into the 16th, and it was not considered morbid in the sense of being unhealthy or disturbing. It was considered instructive, even in its dark way, comforting. To understand the dance of death, you have to understand what the Black Death did to Europe. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague, arriving from Central Asia via trade routes carried by fleas on rats, transmitted to humans with a speed and lethality that seemed literally supernatural, killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe. In some regions and some cities, the death rate was higher. Florence may have lost 60% of its population. Some villages were wiped out entirely. The total death toll across Europe is estimated at somewhere between 25 and 50 million people out of a total population of around 80 million. This is not a statistic. This is a civilizational trauma. Every person alive in Europe in 1351 had lost multiple family members, neighbors, friends, had watched people die in terrifying numbers, had seen bodies piled in the streets, had lived through the complete collapse of normal social functioning, had prayed desperately to God and the saints, and received what appeared to be no answer, had watched priests die, which was particularly alarming, because if the people specially consecrated to mediate between humans and God could not get divine protection, what did that say? And then, before the recovery was complete, the plague came back. It returned in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, in 1390, in 1400. Throughout the 15th century, plague was a recurring presence in European life. Not always at the catastrophic scale of the first wave, but always there, always killing, always capable of returning at full force. A generation of Europeans grew up knowing that death could arrive without warning, without logic, without regard for age or virtue or status, and could kill a quarter of the people around them before moving on. The cultural response to this was not simply grief, though there was grief. It was a profound and widespread renegotiation of the relationship between the living and death. Death moved from being a background condition of human life, always present, universally understood, but not dwelt upon, to being a constant, vivid, imaginatively central presence. Medieval people, after the Black Death, did not try not to think about death. They thought about it deliberately, systematically, artistically, and theologically. They made it a subject of meditation. They turned it into art. The danse macabre was the most theatrical expression of this, but it was not the only one. The genre of ars moriendi, the art of dying, produced dozens of widely circulated manuals on how to die well, how to prepare spiritually, how to resist the temptations that the devil would supposedly bring to your deathbed, how to make a good final confession, how to die in a state of grace. These were not gloomy texts. They were practical. They were guides in the same spirit as a guide to cooking or farming, to an activity that everyone was going to have to do, and that it was better to do skillfully than badly. There were also transy tombs, tomb sculptures that depicted the deceased not in idealized living form, as earlier medieval tomb sculpture had done, but as a decomposing corpse. A rotting body, sometimes with worms, carved in stone or alabaster, placed in the tomb with the same care and expense that earlier patrons had lavished on idealized effigies. These were not commissioned by people who hated themselves or who were being punished. They were commissioned by wealthy, powerful people. Bishops, nobles, merchants, who wanted their tomb to make a specific theological point, that the body was temporary, that worldly glory was temporary, that what mattered was the soul and its condition at death. The transy tomb was a memento mori, a reminder of death turned into monumental art. The dance macabre added something specific to this tradition, the democratic quality of death. The great chain of dancers moving through the mural was explicitly organized by social rank, pope, emperor, king, but as the point was that rank made no difference. Death came for the pope as surely as for the peasant. The emperor's crown did not buy a single extra day. This was not a politically radical message in the modern sense. The mural was not calling for revolution or the overthrow of the social order, but it was a leveling message, and it carried genuine comfort for the lower orders of society, because it said that the suffering and inequality of earthly life was temporary, and that death, when it came, would be no respecter of privilege. The dance itself, the image of skeletons and living people actually dancing together, carried specific meaning. Dancing was one of the great communal pleasures of medieval life, a social activity associated with celebration and community. Having death join the dance was a way of making it familiar, domesticating it, taking away its power to terrify by incorporating it into something known and shared. Death was not a monster lurking outside the circle. Death was in the circle. Death had always been in the circle. You might as well learn the steps. Weird? The idea of decorating your local churchyard with floor-to-ceiling murals of dancing skeletons, dragging the Pope into the grave, and finding this comforting? Yes, that is a cultural response that takes some explaining to a modern audience. We tend to quarantine death, to keep it behind hospital curtains and professional management, to treat it as a failure rather than a destination. The medieval post-plague response was, in many ways, the opposite. To pull death into the center of cultural life, to look at it directly, to make art about it, to joke about it, to dance with it. There is a reasonable argument. I'm not saying it is correct. I'm saying it is reasonable that the medieval way of dealing with mass death was psychologically healthier than our way. Not more comfortable, not more pleasant, but more honest, more integrated, more capable of producing meaning from something that resists meaning. Every Halloween skeleton, every sugar skull at Dia de los Muertos, every skull and crossbones, motif in art and jewelry and tattoos is a distant echo of the danse macabre, of the human impulse to grin back at the grinning skull and say, "Yes, I know. I have always known. Now let us dance." Chapter 10. Medieval Sex. Education. What your doctor thought was happening in. There. You are a married woman in 13th century France. You have just been to see your physician. You told him that you and your husband have been trying to conceive a child for several months without success. He has listened carefully. He has examined you, or at least the aspects of you that it is appropriate for a physician to examine, which in a proper medical encounter is primarily your urine, your complexion, and your general humoral constitution. And he has given you his considered medical opinion. The problem, he explains, is that you are failing to experience sufficient pleasure during intercourse. Without your pleasure, without your reaching a particular culmination of experience that he describes in clinical but fairly explicit terms, you will not produce the seed necessary for conception. You need to enjoy yourself more. This is medicine. He is writing it down. Medieval sexual physiology was built on a foundation of ancient Greek and Roman theory, primarily Galen, again, filtered through medieval scholarship, and it was wrong in ways that are both fascinating and, in some specific cases, accidentally progressive. The basic model that most medieval physicians worked with held that both men and women produced seed, a generative substance, and that both seeds were necessary for conception. This was the two-seed theory, and it had been debated since antiquity with some authorities, following Aristotle, holding that only men produced seed and that women provided only the material for the embryo, while others, following Hippocrates and Galen, maintained the two-seed model. The two-seed theory had a specific implication that showed up repeatedly in medieval medical texts. If women needed to produce seed for conception to occur, and if seed was produced only through the experience of sexual pleasure, the female equivalent of male orgasm, then conception required female pleasure. This was not a feminist statement. It was a medical one, derived from a completely wrong biological model. But its practical consequence was that medieval physicians sometimes advised husbands to attend to their wives' pleasure as a matter of reproductive medicine. The marital advice literature of the period, which often had a medical dimension, contains some remarkably direct instruction on this point. The same theory also had a grim flip side. If a woman became pregnant as the result of rape, some medieval legal authorities argued that the pregnancy was evidence she had experienced pleasure, and therefore the assault had not been fully non-consensual. This is a monstrous conclusion that destroyed lives and was used to deny justice to women, and it followed directly from applying the two-seed theory to legal questions. The same wrong biology that occasionally produced progressive marital advice also produced this catastrophic legal reasoning. Ideas have consequences, and those consequences are not always in the same direction. The Church's official position on sex was complicated in ways that the modern stereotype of medieval Christianity as uniformly and hysterically anti-sex tends to flatten. The Church was indeed deeply invested in regulating sexual behavior. The list of prohibited sexual activities was long, specific, and included things that would strike most modern people as bewilderingly detailed. Sex was only licit within marriage. Within marriage, it was only licit for the purpose of procreation. Sex during menstruation was prohibited. Sex on Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, during Lent, during Advent, and on various feast days was prohibited. Sex in any position other than the specific position deemed natural, a concept that Galenic medicine had an elaborate physiological justification for, was suspect at minimum and sinful at maximum. There were penitential handbooks, guides for confessors, that listed all these variations with the penance appropriate to each, in a document so comprehensive that it reads, to modernize, more like an inventory than a moral guide. And yet, and this is crucial, the Church also recognized that humans were sexual beings who had legitimate sexual needs within marriage, and that demanding complete sexual continence from married people was neither realistic nor theologically required. The debate between rigorists, who thought married sex was barely tolerable, and more moderate voices, who thought it was a legitimate and even positive part of marital life, ran continuously through medieval theology. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest systematic theologian of the period, argued that marital sex performed for procreation involved no sin at all, not even a minor one. which was a more positive position than some of his predecessors had taken. The tradition was not monolithic. It argued with itself constantly. Popular culture, meanwhile, had a thoroughly robust and unapologetic relationship with sexuality that the church's official positions did not fully suppress. Medieval literature, fablio, comic tales, Boccaccio's Decameron, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, is full of explicit comic and frequently gleeful sexual content. The Miller's Tale, the Reeve's Tale, the Merchant's Tale. Chaucer's Pilgrims tell stories that would raise eyebrows in many modern contexts, involving adultery, deception, and slapstick violence inflicted on private anatomical areas, all told with cheerful relish to a mixed company of pilgrims, including a nun and a priest. There were also widespread beliefs about sex and reproduction that had no scriptural or medical basis, but persisted tenaciously through popular culture. The idea that maternal imagination during pregnancy could shape the child, that if a pregnant woman looked at a hare, her child might be born with a hare lip, or that if she was frightened by something, the mark of her fright would appear on the child, was widely believed and was actually given some medical respectability by physicians trying to explain birth defects within a humoral framework. The idea that certain foods were sexually stimulating or depressing and that diet could be used to manage sexual desire was standard medical advice. The idea that certain gems, herbs, or amulets could either promote or prevent conception was woven through both popular belief and medical text. What strikes me most about medieval sexuality, reading across the sources, is not the repression, which was real but more contested than the stereotype suggests, but the lack of privacy again. Sex was not, for most medieval people, something that happened in a dedicated private space between two people who were entirely alone. It happened in shared beds, in shared rooms, in houses full of servants and children and apprentices. The curtains around a bed, the tester bed with its surrounding hangings, gave visual privacy, but not acoustic privacy. Medieval people were not prudish about knowing that other people had sex. They just did not particularly think this required witnessing. The casual matter-of-factness about sex in medieval sources, in legal documents, in medical texts, in literature, reflects a world in which sexuality was embedded in communal life in a way that our culture, with its carefully maintained private sphere, does not quite replicate. Weird? The combination of elaborate theological regulation, wrong but occasionally well-intentioned medical theory, cheerfully explicit popular literature, and complete absence of the privacy that modern sexuality takes for granted makes medieval sexual culture one of the genuinely hardest things for modern people to map onto their existing frameworks. It fits none of our categories, neither the sexually liberated nor the sexually repressed. It was its own thing, operating by its own logic, in its own world, which, at this point in the video, should sound familiar. Chapter 11. The Medieval Concept of Time. Clocks were a philosophical crisis. You need to be somewhere at a specific time. It is, let us say, a Wednesday in 1180. You need to meet a merchant on the other side of town at the 9th hour. So you do what anyone would do. You listen for the church bells. You look at the sky. You note where the sun is sitting. And you make your way across town, arriving at approximately the right moment, give or take something between 15 minutes and an hour, which everyone considers perfectly acceptable because the 9th hour is not a precise measurement. It is a rough designation. It is a category of the day, not a point on a line. Medieval time was not our time. This seems like a trivially obvious statement until you start pulling on the thread and realize how deep it goes. The basic unit of medieval time was the canonical hour, a system developed by the Church to organize the daily schedule of monastic life. The day was divided into 7 prayer times: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These were not evenly distributed across 24 clock hours. They were distributed across the period of daylight, which meant they expanded and contracted with the seasons. An hour in midsummer was considerably longer than an hour in midwinter. Time itself breathed with the sun. This is not metaphor. This is how it actually worked. The canonical hours were defined by the position of the sun, not by mechanical precision, and in a world without mechanical clocks, which did not begin to appear in Europe until the late 13th century, and were not widespread or accurate until well into the 14th. The sun and the church bell were all you had. When the bell rang 4 sext, it was midday, regardless of what a clock face would have said. The bell was the clock. Mechanical clocks, when they arrived, were not immediately understood as improvements. They were, in fact, philosophically alarming to some observers. The problem was this: a mechanical clock divided the day into equal hours, 24 of them, each exactly the same length, grinding forward with indifferent mathematical precision, regardless of season, regardless of light, regardless of the organic rhythms of human and natural life. This was not obviously better. It was, in a meaningful sense, a lie. Ours was not equal. Anyone who had ever experienced a short winter afternoon or a long midsummer evening knew this viscerally. The clock was imposing an artificial uniformity on something that was naturally variable. There was also a deeper theological dimension. Time, in medieval Christian thought, was not a neutral container. It was created by God, structured by God, oriented toward God, specifically toward the end of time, toward the return of Christ, toward the last judgment. Sacred time, the liturgical calendar, the cycle of feasts and fasts, the great arc of Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, was the real structure of the year. The canonical hours were an expression of this. They were not just practical scheduling tools, they were prayer. Every hour was a conversation with God. The structure of the day was a liturgical act, introducing a machine that ticked forward with no regard for prayer, no regard for the season, no regard for the relationship between human time and divine time. That was not just a new technology. It was a different philosophy. It was time as quantity rather than time as quality. It was time as resource rather than time as gift. And yet the clocks spread. They spread because they were useful, because merchants needed them, because municipal life required coordination that flexible canonical hours could not provide. Guilds had shift times, courts had deadlines, contracts specified hours. The growing commercial economy of the high and late medieval period ran on coordination, and coordination requires shared time. Not the individual monk listening for bells, but a common standard that everyone in the market agrees on. The public clock, when it arrived on town hall, towers and cathedral facades across Europe, was not just telling time. It was asserting a new relationship between individuals and the community, between experience and measure, between the organic rhythms of pre-industrial life and the abstract mechanical regularity of what was coming. It was, without anyone fully understanding this, a harbinger. When the Strasbourg Cathedral clock was completed in 1354, one of the great mechanical marvels of the age, with an astronomical display, an automated rooster that crowed at noon, and a procession of figures representing the Magi. Crowds came from across Europe to look at it. They were not just admiring the engineering. They were watching the future arrive, a future in which time would be not a quality of the day, but a commodity to be spent, managed, wasted, saved, and sold. Weird? To a medieval person, the idea that 2 different hours of the same day could be exactly the same length, that midnight and noon were made of identical material, would have seemed both technically impressive and spiritually suspicious. To us, the idea that time itself could expand and contract depending on the season is the thing that sounds like poetry rather than physics. We are the ones who changed. The clocks changed us, and we do not notice it because we have never known anything else. Chapter 12. Sumptuary Laws. The government decided what you were allowed to wear. You are a successful cloth merchant in 14th century Florence. You have worked hard. Your business is thriving. You have, by any reasonable measure, made it, and you want to celebrate that fact in the most visible way available to you. You want to buy a fur-lined cloak, not a cheap fur, a good fur, ermine, maybe, or sable, something that says, when you walk into a room, that you are a person of substance. You cannot, not legally. Ermine is for nobles. Sable is for nobles. The specific shade of crimson you were also eyeing for a new doublet is, depending on which version of the current sumptuary legislation you are reading, reserved for people of significantly higher social rank than a cloth merchant, however successful. You can wear fur, yes, but only the furs specified for your station. You can wear red, but not that red. You can wear silk, but not more than a specified quantity of it, and not more than a specified number of garments, and not with gold embroidery above a certain weight. Sumptuary laws. Regulations governing what people of different social ranks were permitted to wear, eat, spend, and display were one of the most widespread and most consistently ignored forms of medieval legislation. They existed across Europe, in England, France, Germany, Italy, the Spanish kingdoms, and beyond. They were reissued repeatedly, which tells you something about how well they were working. When you have to pass the same law 17 times in a century, it is a reasonable inference that the law is not being followed. The reasoning behind sumptuary laws was not primarily snobbery, though snobbery was certainly present. The stated rationale was social order. Medieval society was conceived as hierarchical by nature and by divine design. The 3 orders. Theory held that God had organized human society into 3 estates, those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked, and that this division was not merely conventional, but cosmically appropriate. Each order had its function, its dignity, its proper place in the great scheme of things. And visible display, clothing especially, but also food, furniture, transportation, and ceremony, was how that place was communicated and maintained. If a merchant dressed like a knight, the visual language of social order broke down. If a peasant's wife wore silk, the signifiers that told you at a glance who you were dealing with became unreliable. And in a world without identity documents, without photographs, without most of the mechanisms we use to establish who people are and what their standing is, visual display was doing enormously important social work. Your clothing was your credentials. Your hat communicated your rank. Your belt buckle had legal implications. The laws were also, less nobly, a reaction to the economic disruptions of the 13th and 14th centuries, which had produced a newly wealthy merchant class in the Italian city-states and the commercial towns of Flanders and the Rhine. These people had money, often more money than many nobles, and they spent it in ways that made the traditional aristocracy deeply uncomfortable because it was possible, increasingly visibly possible, to look like a noble without being one. The sumptuary laws were, in part, an attempt by the established orders to maintain visual monopolies on the markers of their status, at a moment when economic change was threatening to make those markers democratically available. The specific targets of sumptuary legislation reveal the anxieties of each moment. English sumptuary laws of the mid-14th century were preoccupied with fur. Italian laws of the same period were obsessed with the length of women's trains, the quantity of embroidery on their sleeves, and the height of their shoes. Platform shoes called chopins had become fashionable and were specifically legislated against in multiple jurisdictions, with maximum heights specified in the law. A Venetian law of 1430 limited chopin height to 3 inches. By the 16th century, Venetian chopins were being made at heights of 20 inches or more, which required the wearer to be accompanied by 2 servants to prevent her from toppling over, and which suggests that the legislation had not been particularly effective. There were also sumptuary laws directed at Jews and Muslims in Christian Europe. Requirements to wear identifying badges or clothing that marked religious difference. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the same council that abolished trial by ordeal, mandated that Jews across Christendom wear distinctive clothing: the yellow badge, the pointed hat, the strip of cloth in a specified color. These were sumptuary law, used not to enforce hierarchy within Christian society, but to enforce visible separation between communities. This is the darkest application of the logic, and its shadow extends far beyond the Middle Ages. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was a bureaucratic nightmare, and the records of enforcement tell you everything about the gap between legislation and reality. Fines were levied repeatedly on the same people, which suggests either that the fines were affordable enough to pay as a cost of doing business, or that the enforcement was inconsistent enough that you could usually get away with it. In some Italian cities, noble ladies who wanted to wear a forbidden jewel or garment simply paid the fine in advance. A pre-purchased exemption that effectively converted the sumptuary law into a luxury tax. The laws faded gradually across the 16th and 17th centuries, eroded by the same commercial forces that had produced the newly wealthy merchant classes in the first place. In a world of increasing trade, increasing wealth, and increasing mobility, the attempt to freeze social display in law became untenable. What replaced it was not equality, but something more subtle: the social codes of fashion, taste, and conspicuous consumption that the market developed to do the same work the laws had been doing. You could wear anything, technically, but certain things announced you as someone who understood the codes, and others announced you as someone who did not. The sumptuary law became internalized. The enforcement mechanism became social judgment rather than legal fine. We are still living in this system. The designer label, the specific vocabulary of luxury goods, the ability to read at a glance who has and who has not, who is and who is not. This is sumptuary law by other means. The same information encoded in the same visible displays, maintained by the same mix of aspiration and contempt. The only difference is that we do not call it law. We call it taste. Chapter 13. The Medieval University. Students were armed, drunk, and technically above the law. You are 19 years old. It is the year 1260. You have arrived in Paris from somewhere in the north of England, having traveled for several weeks, carrying what little you own, to begin your studies at what is already one of the most celebrated institutions of learning in the Christian world, the University of Paris. You are excited. You're also hungry, cold, and almost entirely broke, which is, you will discover, the standard condition of the medieval student. You find lodgings in the Latin Quarter, named for the language everyone uses, since students from across Europe need a common tongue. And Latin is it. Your room is small, and shared with at least 3 other students. Your meals are irregular. Your schedule is punishing. Lectures begin before dawn and run through most of the day, conducted by scholars who speak rapidly and expect you to keep up, in a Latin that is several registers, more technical than anything you learned at home. The books you need cost more than you will earn in a year. Most students cannot afford to own them. You borrow, copy, memorize, and suffer. And yet, you are a university student in Paris. And that means something very specific in legal terms. Medieval universities existed in a genuinely unusual legal position. They had been granted royal and papal charters that gave them a significant degree of autonomy. The right to govern themselves, to try their own members in their own courts, to operate outside the normal jurisdiction of the city around them. This was the result of a series of negotiations between the university masters, the crown, and the papacy, each of whom wanted the university for different reasons and was willing to grant it privileges to secure its loyalty and cooperation. The practical consequence of this was that a university student who committed a crime, got into a fight, damaged property, assaulted a townsperson, committed any of the wide range of offenses that 19-year-old men away from home for the first time tend to commit, could claim the right to be tried by the university's own court rather than the city's. The city court might sentence you to a fine, flogging, or worse. The university court, run by scholars who had a vested interest in protecting the student body, was considerably more likely to let you off with a lecture and a penance. This was, from the perspective of the city of Paris, an absolutely infuriating arrangement, and the city of Paris said so, repeatedly and loudly, across the entire medieval period. The relationship between town and gown, between the local residents and the university population, was one of sustained, low-grade hostility punctuated by occasional outright violence. The students were not behaving well. This is worth being clear about. Medieval students drank prodigiously, brawled constantly, conducted ongoing harassment, campaigns against local merchants, fought with students from other nations. The university organized itself by nations, regional groupings, and the English nation and the French nation might go from academic rivals to actual street fighters, depending on the provocation, and generally conducted themselves in ways that would get you expelled from any modern university and prosecuted under any modern legal system. They also carried weapons. Carrying a knife was normal for any medieval man. Carrying a sword was common among students from noble families. The combination of weapons, alcohol, youth, enforced poverty, and legal semi-immunity created a social situation that was, by any measure, volatile. The Saint Scholastica Day Riot of 1355 in Oxford is the most dramatic example of what this volatility could produce. It began with a dispute in a tavern. 2 Oxford students complained about the quality of the wine. The tavern keeper disagreed. Words were exchanged, and then a jug of wine was thrown at the tavern keeper's head. This was the spark. Over the next 3 days, a full-scale battle erupted between the university and the town, with students and townspeople fighting in the streets, students storming and looting shops, townspeople, reinforced by men from the surrounding countryside, attacking the university halls. By the time it was over, somewhere between 30 and 60 students were dead, with an unknown number of townspeople. The king had to intervene personally. The legal aftermath was, by modern standards, remarkable. The town of Oxford was found substantially at fault. The town was required annually, on the feast day of St. Scholastica, to pay a fine to the university and to send representatives to attend a mass at the university church for the souls of the dead students. This obligation, The town of Oxford, formally apologizing to the university once a year, continued until 1825. For nearly 5 centuries, the town was ceremonially subordinate to the institution as penance for a 3-day riot in 1355. The intellectual life inside the universities was in extraordinary contrast to all of this, one of the genuine achievements of medieval civilization. The curriculum, initially the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, then the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and eventually the higher faculties of theology, law, and medicine, was demanding, sophisticated, and international. Scholars moved between universities across Europe with remarkable freedom. A student from Bologna might go to study in Paris. A Parisian master might take a position in Oxford. The great theological debates of the period about the nature of universals, the relationship between faith and reason, the extent of papal authority, the nature of the Trinity, were conducted across national boundaries in a common language among a community of scholars who knew each other's work and argued with it in detail. The university was, in this sense, medieval Europe's first genuinely international intellectual institution. It produced the scholastic method, the rigorous, formally structured debate by which claims were made, objections raised, and responses formulated, that shaped European intellectual life for centuries. Thomas Aquinas was a university man. Roger Bacon, who anticipated something like the scientific method, was a university man. Dante was shaped by university education. The universities were, for all their chaos, doing something real, weird. The image of armed, legally semi-exempt teenagers brawling in the streets while simultaneously developing the logical foundations of Western philosophy is a combination that does not map cleanly onto any modern category. We have students, we have riots, we have legal exemptions and town and gown tensions, but we do not have quite this particular combination of intellectual seriousness and medieval violence, all wrapped in the same fur-lined academic gown, in the same narrow alleys of the same Latin Quarter, in the same cold and hungry and consequential year of 1260. Chapter 14. Pilgrimage, the medieval road trip, was also a spiritual crisis and a party you are leaving home. This is not a small thing. You have arranged for your affairs to be managed while you're gone. You have made a will, not because you expect to die, though dying is a real possibility, but because pilgrimage is the kind of undertaking you make proper preparations for, in the same spirit that you would make preparations for a sea voyage or a military campaign. You have sewn a badge onto your hat, the scallop shell of Santiago de Compostela, your intended destination, 600 miles away in the northwest corner of Spain. And the badge announces to everyone who sees you exactly what you are doing and why. You are a pilgrim. You are under the protection of the church. You are on your way to the bones of an apostle, and you are going to be gone for the better part of a year. Medieval pilgrimage was one of the most paradoxical institutions of the age. It was simultaneously a profound act of spiritual devotion and one of the most reliable opportunities medieval people had for extended travel, adventure, commercial exchange, cultural exposure, and the company of strangers from across the known world. It was the combination of these things, not the tension between them, that made it what it was. The spiritual logic was straightforward within the medieval framework. A pilgrimage was an act of penance, a visible, physical, costly expression of contrition that demonstrated the seriousness of your repentance in a way that simply saying, sorry could not. It was also an act of petition. You went to the saint's shrine to ask for something specific, a healing, a resolution to a legal dispute, the safe delivery of a pregnancy, the return of a missing person. It was an act of thanksgiving. You went because a prayer had already been answered, and you had promised God, in your moment of desperation, that you would go if He came through. And it was simply an act of devotion. You went because the saint was there, because proximity to holiness was inherently valuable, because the road itself was a form of prayer. But the road was also the road, and the road in the Middle Ages was a remarkable social space. Pilgrimage routes, the Via Francigena from Canterbury to Rome, the Camino de Santiago across France and northern Spain, the routes to Jerusalem for those wealthy and adventurous enough to attempt the Holy Land, were not wilderness paths. They were heavily trafficked, economically significant corridors lined with hostels, taverns, hospitals, and chapels, all built to serve the constant flow of foot traffic. The economies of entire towns were built around the pilgrim trade, souvenirs, badges, ampullae filled with blessed water or oil small. Medals of the relevant saint were sold in industrial quantities. Food, beds, horses, guides, security, all of this was available for purchase, at prices that a medieval pilgrim would have found both reassuring and outrageous. The company on the road was extraordinary. Pilgrimage was one of the few medieval institutions that routinely mixed social classes and nationalities in a sustained, intimate context. A group of pilgrims traveling from England to Santiago might include a knight, a merchant, a prosperous widow, a minor clergyman, a skilled tradesperson, and a peasant doing penance for something they declined to specify, all walking the same road, sleeping in the same hostels, sharing the same meals. This is Chaucer's insight, and it is why the Canterbury Tales work as a literary frame. Pilgrimage was one of the only circumstances in which a 14th century English writer could plausibly put all of those people in the same space, talking to each other for weeks at a time. The talking was considerable. Medieval people on pilgrimage were not a silent, meditative procession of penitents. Contemporary accounts describe singing, storytelling, argument, flirtation, gambling, music, and the kind of gossip that accumulates when a diverse group of strangers spends weeks together with nowhere else to be. The hostels were social hubs. The taverns along the way were busier than most urban taverns because they had a captive clientele that was far from home, somewhat freed from the social constraints of their local community, and often in a mood to celebrate their journey. The church was persistently uncomfortable with this. Pilgrimage was supposed to be a serious spiritual undertaking, and the gap between the ideal pilgrim, prayerful, continent, focused on the sacred goal, and the actual pilgrim, who was singing bawdy songs in a tavern in Pamplona and had possibly not thought about spiritual matters since Burgos, was a source of ongoing pastoral complaint. The satirists noticed too. Erasmus, Chaucer, and various other commentators found the contrast between the devotional premise and the holiday reality of pilgrimage irresistible comic material. There is a reason Chaucer's pilgrims are not a uniformly devout group making their way reverently toward the shrine. They are vivid, flawed, funny, and occasionally awful, which is what pilgrimage actually looked like. There was also a genuine danger dimension that modern vacation travel does not replicate. Pilgrimage routes passed through territory controlled by different lords, different kings, different jurisdictions. Bandits were real and well documented. Disease was a constant hazard. You were sleeping in close quarters with strangers from multiple countries. You were eating unfamiliar food and drinking unfamiliar water. You were exhausted and physically depleted. And if you got seriously ill on the road far from home, you were dependent on the charity of strangers and the hospitality of pilgrim hospitals. which varied enormously in quality. Some pilgrims died on the road, some never came back. The will you made before departure was not paranoia. The pilgrim hospitals, hospices established specifically to care for sick and exhausted pilgrims, were one of the genuine social goods that the pilgrimage economy produced. Many were founded by religious orders specifically for this purpose. The Knights Hospitaller, later the Knights of Malta, began as a hospital order caring for pilgrims to Jerusalem. The network of care infrastructure that grew up along major pilgrimage routes was a significant medieval welfare institution, providing food, shelter, and medical care to people who were far from home and had no other recourse. The destination itself, when you finally arrived, was an overwhelming sensory experience designed to be overwhelming. Major shrines, Santiago, Canterbury, Rome, Jerusalem, were theatrical environments. The Aufhoisturm architecture was monumental and deliberately awe-inspiring. The relics were displayed with elaborate ceremony in settings of gold and jewels and candlelight, surrounded by the accumulated ex-votos, wax limbs, model ships, painted panels, crutches, left by pilgrims whose prayers had been answered. The atmosphere was a blend of reverence, spectacle, and commerce that modern people sometimes find dissonant, but that medieval pilgrims apparently found entirely coherent, because all of these things were aspects of the same experience. And then you walked home. Weird? By modern standards, taking a year off from your life to walk 600 miles on the promise of spiritual benefits available at the other end, risking bandits, disease, weather, and financial ruin in the process, sounds like an extreme sporting event with theological branding, but by the standards of a medieval person, for whom the eternal soul was a more pressing concern than the earthly schedule, and for whom the road itself was a living social world, rather than a logistical inconvenience to be minimized. It was simply the obvious response to certain kinds of spiritual need. And there is something else worth noting. The Camino de Santiago, the oldest of these routes, still exists. It was walked by hundreds of thousands of people last year, by people from every country in the world, the vast majority of whom are not medieval Catholics seeking indulgence and the intercession of an apostle. They are modern people, secular and religious, walking the same road for reasons they find genuinely difficult to articulate. Something about slowing down, something about community with strangers, something about putting one foot in front of another for weeks until the noise quiets and something underneath it becomes audible. They collect their stamps in their pilgrim passports. They sleep in the same hostels. They talk to strangers. They arrive at the cathedral in Santiago and feel something that they were not entirely expecting. 800 years later, the road is still doing what the road does. Some things, it turns out, are not so weird after all. Chapter 15. The medieval concept of the afterlife was extremely bureaucratic. You're dying. This is not a surprise. You are old, it is winter, and you have lived long enough to know what the cold settling into your chest means. Your family is around you. The priest has come. The candles are lit. And you are, in the particular way of your time and place, not especially afraid of death itself. You are afraid of what comes immediately after, not hell necessarily. Hell is for the genuinely wicked, for unrepentant murderers, for heretics, for people who died without confession. You have lived a decent life. You have gone to Mass. You have confessed regularly. Hell, you are reasonably confident, is not your destination. But heaven is not your destination either. Not yet, and not for a very long time. Between you and heaven stands something considerably more complicated. Purgatory. The doctrine of purgatory the belief that souls who died in a state of grace, but with unresolved sin still attached to them, passed through a period of purifying suffering before entering heaven, was one of the most consequential theological developments of the medieval period, and it shaped medieval life in ways that reached into economics, art, politics, family structure, and the daily texture of ordinary existence. The logic was this: sin had two dimensions. There was guilt, the spiritual rupture caused by the sin itself, which was resolved through confession and absolution. And there was temporal punishment, the debt owed to divine justice for the disorder the sin had caused in the world, which was not automatically canceled by absolution. Penance, the prayers, fasting, or other acts a confessor assigned after confession, was meant to discharge this debt. But most people died with the debt only partially paid. They had been absolved. They were going to heaven, but they still owed something, and purgatory was where you paid it. The duration of your time in purgatory was, in principle, proportional to the weight of your outstanding debt. A minor sinner who had been consistently devout might spend a relatively short time there. A major sinner, someone who had led a chaotic moral life, confessed at the last possible moment, and died with enormous accumulated debt, might spend centuries. The time was not wasted. It was understood as genuinely purifying, as a burning away of the residue of sin that the soul needed to shed before it could bear the direct presence of God. It was not pleasant. Medieval descriptions of purgatory borrowed heavily from descriptions of hell in terms of fire and suffering. The crucial difference was that it ended. This created an immediate practical question: could anything be done to reduce a soul's time in purgatory? And the EIFY answer, developed through centuries of theological refinement, was yes. Prayer helped. Masses said for the dead helped. Acts of charity performed in someone's name helped. And most consequentially, indulgences helped. An indulgence was a formal remission of temporal punishment, a document issued by the Church under papal authority that canceled a specified quantity of purgatorial debt. It could be obtained through specific prayers, through pilgrimage, through acts of charity, or, and this is where the system became economically spectacular, through donation. Giving money to a worthy cause, a church building project, a crusade, a hospital, could earn an indulgence. And the indulgence could be applied not just to yourself, but to souls already in purgatory, to your dead mother, your dead husband, your dead children. This was not originally a cynical invention. The theological roots were genuine, but the economic implications were extraordinary. Across the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the indulgence economy became one of the most significant financial mechanisms in European Christendom. Churches were built on it. Crusades were funded by it. Popes ran their administrations partly on its proceeds, and the emotional logic was irresistible. If your beloved mother was suffering in purgatory, and you could shorten that suffering by giving money to build a cathedral, only a monster would refuse to give. The fact that the cathedral was also extremely useful to the institution collecting the money was, everyone agreed, a happy coincidence. The administration of all of this was, by any measure, Baroque. Anniversary masses. Masses said annually for the soul of a specified dead person, were endowed by wealthy donors with specific sums of money meant to fund the masses in perpetuity. Chantry chapels, private chapels attached to churches, staffed by a chantry priest whose sole job was to say masses for the soul of our founding donor and their family, multiplied across England and the continent. Great families maintained elaborate networks of intercessory prayer, specified numbers of masses per year, in specified churches by specified clergy funded by specified endowments, all generating spiritual credit directed at the purgatorial account of the family's dead. It was, in the most literal sense, a celestial accounting system. The paperwork was real. The endowments were legally binding. The chantry priest who failed to say his masses was in breach of contract with both his employer and the dead. The system also created a remarkable intimacy between the living and the dead. Medieval people did not think of the dead as simply gone, as having moved to a separate realm with no connection to the present. They thought of the dead as nearby, as still part of the community, still needful, still capable of being helped. Prayers for the dead were not memorial gestures. They were practical interventions. When you prayed for your dead grandmother, you were doing something real for her, something she needed, something that would shorten her suffering and accelerate her passage to heaven. The dead were, in a genuine sense, your dependents. This created obligations that ran in both directions. The living prayed for the dead, and the dead, once they reached heaven and were in the presence of God, were expected to intercede for the living, to put in a good word, to pray on behalf of the family that had prayed for them, to use their position near the divine to benefit the people still struggling through earthly life. It was a mutual aid society that transcended death. Family membership did not lapse at the grave. Then Martin Luther, in 1517, nailed his objections to a church door in Wittenberg, and the whole magnificent, maddening, deeply human structure began to come apart. His core objection that the church had no authority to issue remissions of divine punishment, that purgatory was unscriptural, that the indulgence trade was a fraud perpetuated on the grieving, struck the system at its theological foundation. The Reformation's rejection of purgatory was not just a doctrinal quibble. It was a demolition of an entire economy, an entire set of social relationships, an entire way of understanding the connection between the living and the dead. The chantry chapels were dissolved, the endowments were seized, the anniversary masses stopped, and the dead, in the Protestant imagination, were suddenly, finally, cleanly gone. In heaven or hell, with nothing in between, with nothing the living could do for them, with no ongoing relationship that required tending. Whether this was a liberation or a loss is a question that different people have answered differently for 500 years. What is certain is that the psychological weight of it was enormous, an entire support structure for grief. The sense that you could still do something for the people you had lost, that the relationship continued, that your prayers reached them, was dismantled in a generation. Weird? The idea of a divine waiting room with a measurable, reducible, legally contractable sentence. The idea that you could set up a trust fund to pay for your soul's release centuries after your death. The idea that the dead were still your responsibility and you were still theirs. That is genuinely strange to modern sensibilities, even many religious ones. But the need it served, the human refusal to let the dead simply go, the insistence that love continues across the boundary that everything else stops at, that is not strange at all. That is just Tuesday. That has always been Tuesday. We have only changed the paperwork. Conclusion. So what does all of this actually mean? We have covered a lot of ground. We have stood in a town square watching a man pick up a burning iron glove. We have handed a flask of urine to a physician and watched him hold it up to the light. We have gotten into a communal bath with strangers. We have watched a pig be dressed in human clothes and hanged for murder. We have packed a lunch for a public execution. We have gone to sleep for the first time. We have prayed over a bone in a golden box. We have danced with a skeleton on a church wall. We have received medical advice about the relationship between pleasure and reproduction. that was wrong in a very specific direction. And if we have done this right, if we have done what good history is supposed to do, then hopefully those things are not just weird to you anymore. Hopefully they are comprehensible, not acceptable necessarily, not desirable, but comprehensible. The product of a coherent worldview, a set of assumptions about the nature of reality, the structure of society, the relationship between the human and the divine, that made these practices not just tolerable, but logical. That is the thing about the past. It is genuinely foreign. It is not just a worse version of the present, not just the present with inferior technology and crueler punishments and worse dental care. It is a different country with different maps. The people who lived in it were not stupid. They were not crueler than us, not by nature. They were human, which means they had the full range of human capacities, including compassion, humor, love, ingenuity, and the ability to be terrible to each other. But they operated within frameworks of understanding that were different from ours in deep and consequential ways. And here is the uncomfortable thought that I want to leave you with. Some of those frameworks were wrong, and we know they were wrong, and we congratulate ourselves on having moved past them. The trial by ordeal was wrong. The four humors were wrong. The two-seed theory of reproduction was wrong. The miasma theory of disease was wrong. These were not just different, they were false. Reality does not work that way, and the people who believed it did suffered real consequences for that false belief. But, and this is the part I want you to sit with, we also have frameworks. We also have assumptions so deep and so widely shared that we cannot see them, the way you cannot see the air you are breathing. And some of those assumptions, from the vantage point of a historian 800 years from now, will look exactly the way the urine wheel looks to us. Confident, systematized, earnest, and wrong in ways that caused real suffering that a different set of assumptions would have avoided. We do not know which ones. That is rather the point. If we knew, we would change them. The medieval physician, holding the medulla up to the light, did not know he was wrong either. He was applying the best knowledge available to him, with genuine care for his patient, within a system that made complete sense, given everything he had been taught and everything he had observed. He was doing his best, and his best was, in several important respects, not good enough. So are we. And we will not know which respects until someone from the future looks back at us and makes a video about the weird things that were perfectly normal in the early 21st century. And I imagine they will have quite a lot of material to work with. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is a long video about dead people doing strange things. And the fact that you stayed means you are exactly the kind of person who should be watching this channel. If you want more of this, more history told as close to ground level as we can get it, more putting yourself into the shoes of people whose shoes were genuinely very different from yours, subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from. And the next time you wake up at 3 a.m. and cannot get back to sleep, remember, that is not insomnia. That is history. Your body is doing something very old, something it learned across 1,000 years of dark winter nights in thatched houses by cooling fires. Lie there. Think about the pig trial. Think about the dancing skeletons. Think about the physician and his glass flask held up to the morning light. And then go back to sleep. The second sleep is the good one. They always said so.